It was a gloomy evening when Ethan received the package. It wasn't his birthday, and there were no celebrations around it. The package was unexpected, and the sender was unknown. Just his name, scribbled in an elegant, unfamiliar hand on the top of the cardboard box, accompanied by a single stamp from a place he had never heard of. He stared at the box for a few moments, hesitant but curious. With a sigh, he sat at the edge of his bed and carefully opened it. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a clock, an antique, brass clock, with delicate hands and a polished wood casing that gleamed even under the dim light of his room. The clock looked old, but in a way that suggested it had been cherished for years, lovingly cared for. There was no note inside, no explanation, only the clock. And yet, for reasons Ethan couldn't explain, a strange sense of foreboding crept over him. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, as if the room itself was aware of the strange object in his hands. But he shook off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. He placed the clock on his nightstand, and it sat there quietly, its hands frozen in place. Ethan's gaze lingered on it, and a shiver ran down his spine. Despite its quiet appearance, something about it felt wrong, as though it were waiting for something. Later that night, as he sat on his bed, scrolling through his phone, the first sound came. A slow, steady tick-tock. It echoed through the silence of the room, unnerving in its intensity. Ethan froze, looking toward the nightstand. The clock's hands had moved. He hadn't noticed it earlier, but now they were shifting, the minute hand moving ever so slowly. He couldn't help but stare, his heart rate quickening as the clock ticked once more. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The rhythm felt off, like the sound of a heartbeat, but one that wasn't his own. A strange chill swept through him, and he instinctively pulled the blankets tighter around himself. As the night stretched on, the ticking became louder, more pronounced, each tick seeming to echo in his ears. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it wouldn't stop. The sensation that something was wrong gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing second. Why was the clock ticking at such odd intervals? The next morning, Ethan woke up groggily to find the clock still ticking away, its hands now in the same position they had been when he fell asleep. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling it left him with. It wasn't unusual for an old clock to have some quirks, he reasoned. Maybe it just needed some winding, something he hadn't thought to do the night before. He reached for the clock, inspecting it closely. As his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a small inscription on the back of the clock caught his eye. It read, "Time is not a straight line." Ethan blinked in confusion. What did that mean? Was it some sort of cryptic message? It didn't make sense. He turned the clock over and over in his hands, trying to find something more that could explain the strange inscription. But it seemed to be just an odd, out-of-place phrase. The ticking resumed, louder than before, breaking through his thoughts. Ethan jumped, startled by how sharp the sound had become. He quickly checked the time, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw that it was exactly 3 a.m. He didn't remember the clock ever ticking so loudly before. He couldn't remember how long it had been since it started again, but it felt as if time itself had bent around this clock. The minutes stretched out like an endless void. His thoughts began to spiral. Why had the clock ticked at that exact hour? And why had it started ticking in the first place? Something about the clock felt off, wrong even. His mind raced with possible explanations. Had it been broken? Was it just an ordinary clock after all, or was there something more to it? Later that evening, he did some research. Ethan found out that the clock was manufactured by a small, now-defunct company from the early 1900s. There was little information online about the brand, but he did come across an old forum discussing timepieces with strange, unexplained phenomena. Some users claimed that certain antique clocks had the power to distort time, bending it to their will, making the hands of time move erratically, creating illusions of time lost or gained. The more Ethan read, the more uneasy he became. He had never heard of anything like this before. He thought he might be losing his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was somehow involved. It wasn't just the ticking. There was something off about the way it worked, something supernatural. As night fell again, Ethan prepared himself for whatever might come. He turned on all the lights in his room, but still the clock ticked. Tick, tock, tick, tock. And then the unthinkable happened. The clock's hands began to spin wildly, moving faster than he could keep up with, faster than time should have allowed. His stomach dropped, and the room around him seemed to pulse with energy, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Suddenly, everything went dark. Ethan reached for his phone, trying to use the light to see, but the screen remained black. He was plunged into complete darkness, the only sound the maddening tick-tock of the clock. And then, the unmistakable feeling of a presence filled the room. Something was there with him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the darkness pressed in around him. The tick-tock of the clock continued, steady and mechanical, but the room was no longer silent. It was as if something invisible, yet undeniably present, was moving within the shadows. His pulse quickened, and every hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He reached out, desperately trying to find the light switch, but the air around him felt thick, as though he were wading through a heavy fog. His fingers brushed against the walls, but they felt cold, unnaturally cold, like ice. Then, just as quickly as the darkness had fallen, the lights flickered back to life. Ethan blinked in the harsh light, his heart hammering in his chest. The clock was still ticking, louder than ever, its hands spinning faster now, an erratic blur of motion. He turned his gaze to the source of the sound, the clock. But this time, it wasn't just the ticking that unsettled him. There, in the reflection of the glass, he saw something. A figure. For a split second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But the figure was there, standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. A shadow, tall and thin, its features distorted and unclear, but it was there, undeniably present. Ethan froze, unable to move, as the figure seemed to shift slightly, as though it were aware of him. His heart raced. He blinked, and it was gone. The room was still, too still. Ethan didn't know if he had imagined it, if his fear was playing tricks on him, but he knew one thing for sure. The presence, the feeling of being watched, hadn't gone away. It lingered, a weight in the air, suffocating him. The clock ticked on. What was happening to him? Why had the clock's strange behavior escalated so suddenly? And who or what was that figure? He had to figure it out. He couldn't just sit here paralyzed by fear. But as he reached for his phone to call someone, it flickered again, the battery dying out as though the darkness had consumed it. He cursed under his breath. He needed answers, but where could he find them? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was somehow connected to whatever was happening to him. The strange inscription on the back of the clock, "Time is not a straight line," kept echoing in his mind. Was it trying to tell him something? Was time, in fact, being warped, stretched, or distorted in some way? His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the clock was cursed. Maybe it was more than just a timepiece. It could be some sort of portal, or worse, a conduit for something beyond this world. Unable to take it any longer, Ethan snatched the clock off the nightstand and studied it again, searching for any clue that might explain its strange behavior. The ticking slowed momentarily, as if the clock was aware of his scrutiny. But then, In an instant, the hands jerked back to their frantic spinning. He cursed again and set the clock back down, his frustration mounting. But just as he did, something peculiar happened. The temperature in the room dropped, the air turning ice cold, and he could see his breath in the air. A low, guttural whisper began to fill the room. A voice speaking in a language he didn't understand. It was faint, almost inaudible, but there was no mistaking the malevolence in its tone. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing. The whisper grew louder, sharper, as though the room itself was speaking to him. Time is not what it seems. The voice was clear now, and it wasn't just in the air. It was inside his head. The words echoed, reverberating in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread. He felt himself being pulled, drawn toward the clock once more, as if some invisible force was guiding him. The hands of the clock stopped spinning, and then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, they began to move once more. This time, they moved backward. Ethan gasped. He reached for the clock again, his fingers trembling as he tried to stop it. But it was as if the clock had a life of its own. The second hand moved in reverse, ticking backward, pulling time along with it. He could feel it. Something was shifting. Something was wrong. His vision blurred for a moment, and suddenly he wasn't in his room anymore. He was standing outside. Ethan blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. His apartment building, the very one he had lived in for months, was gone. In its place was an old, dilapidated house, one he had never seen before. The windows were cracked, the roof sagging with age. The door stood ajar, as though inviting him inside. A chill ran down his spine. How had he gotten here? Was this a dream? Had the clock somehow transported him to another place? Or was he losing his mind? He stumbled forward, his feet carrying him toward the door as though they were controlled by something other than his own will. He tried to stop himself, to turn around, but the cold presence he had felt before surrounded him once again, urging him forward. With each step he took, the whispering voice grew louder. "Time is not what it seems," it repeated. "You must understand, Ethan. You must understand before it's too late." He reached the threshold of the house, and as his hand touched the door, it creaked open on its own. Inside, the house was dark and silent. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in old photographs. Pictures of people he didn't recognize, people whose eyes seemed to follow him as he moved through the hallway. There was a sense of abandonment here, but also something darker, something that made his skin crawl. At the end of the hall, there was a room. It stood at the end of a long corridor, the door slightly ajar, as though waiting for him. Ethan didn't know what to expect, but something deep inside him told him that he had to go. He had to find out what was behind that door. He took a step forward, and then another, his breath quickening. The door creaked open as he approached it, revealing a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, except for the clock. The clock that now stood in the center of the room, its hands spinning backward again, as though mocking him. Ethan stepped inside, and the moment he did, the door slammed shut behind him. He was trapped. The ticking grew louder, the whispers more frantic. Time, he realized, was no longer on his side. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed in the empty room, filling the space with an oppressive silence. He stood frozen in place, the cold weight of fear gripping him. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. He couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, he was in his apartment, and the next, he found himself in a strange, decaying house with no explanation. The clock, the same antique piece that had drawn him here, ticked loudly, its second hand moving in reverse. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls as if mocking him. He could feel its presence, its power pressing against him. Ethan took a step back, his feet dragging across the dusty floor. The room felt smaller now, more suffocating. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing damp, rotting wood beneath. There was a sense of neglect here, but also something more sinister. The photographs on the walls seemed to stare at him, their eyes following his every movement. He turned his attention back to the clock. The hands spun erratically now, not just moving backward but warping, distorting as if they were trying to break free from their own limitations. The ticking grew louder, almost deafening. What was this place? Why had the clock brought him here? Ethan's mind raced, but the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He had to find a way out. He had to escape. He moved toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. But when he touched it, the cold metal sent a jolt of panic through his body. The door wouldn't budge. He twisted the handle harder, yanking it in desperation, but it refused to open. His breath came in sharp gasps. Was he trapped? No, this couldn't be happening. There had to be a way out. Then, just as he was about to pound on the door in frustration, he heard a faint sound, a whisper. It was so quiet at first that he almost thought he imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Ethan, his name. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he spun around, his eyes scanning the room. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, an ethereal presence that seemed to be inside his mind. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling, though he wasn't sure why. The silence seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for him to make the next move. The whisper came again, but this time it was closer, more distinct. "Ethan, you must listen. Time is not what it seems." His stomach twisted at the words. He had heard this before in the room with the clock. He had felt it, the presence that surrounded him, pulling him deeper into whatever this was. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice stronger now, but his heart still racing. For a moment, there was nothing but the deafening tick of the clock. Then, from the corner of the room, something stirred. Ethan turned, his eyes widening. There, in the shadows, he saw a figure. It was barely visible, a silhouette against the dim light, but it was there. Person? No, not quite. It was more like a shadow, an outline of something that shouldn't be. It moved, drifting across the room like smoke, its presence making the temperature drop even further. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His legs felt like lead, but somehow he forced himself to take a step closer. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it reached out with a hand. An impossibly long, thin hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The fingers were elongated, twisted, like something from a nightmare. It beckoned him, and for a moment, Ethan stood paralyzed, his body frozen in fear. But something deep inside him told him he had to follow. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let whatever this was take control. He took a cautious step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of the shadowy figure. It gestured toward the clock, and in that moment, the room seemed to shift. The walls around him began to warp, bending in ways they shouldn't. The very fabric of the space around him seemed to distort, as though time itself was unraveling. The clock's ticking grew louder again, deafening. It filled the room, filled his mind, until it was all he could hear. Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting against the overwhelming sensation. He had to break free. Without thinking, he lunged for the clock, his hand gripping its cold, metal casing. The moment his fingers touched the surface, everything went black. For a brief moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. The world around him seemed to collapse, as though he were falling through time itself. He could feel the weight of something pressing against him, pulling him down, but he couldn't move. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, he was back in his apartment. But it wasn't the same. The walls were cracked, the floors were warped, and the air was thick with dust. The furniture was overturned, as if some violent force had ripped through the space. Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't right. This wasn't where he had left off. The clock ticked. It was still there, sitting on the nightstand, its hands spinning wildly. But now it seemed different, more alive, more powerful. It thrummed with energy, vibrating in a way that sent shockwaves through the room. Ethan's mind was reeling. Was this real? Had it all been a dream? No. He knew the clock had done something to him, had transported him somehow. But now he was back in his apartment. Or was it? He approached the clock cautiously, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch it. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of electricity shot through him. His body jerked, and the room seemed to spin. Time itself was warping again, pulling him in every direction at once. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Ethan was left standing in the middle of the room, gasping for air. The clock was silent now, its hands still. The room was unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. There was a weight to it now, a suffocating pressure that made his chest tighten. He looked around, half expecting the shadow to appear again, but there was nothing, just the clock and the silence. Then he heard it, a whisper. Time is not what it seems. Ethan spun around, but once again, there was nothing, except for the clock. The ticking had returned, faster now, each tick like a hammer to his skull. And deep inside, he knew he was no longer in control. Time had him, and it was only a matter of time before he would be lost forever. Ethan awoke with a start, gasping for air. His eyes snapped open, but the world around him was a blur of darkness. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. The sensation of falling, of being pulled through time, lingered in his body, a strange, cold chill that had settled deep into his bones. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, but the silence of the room felt deafening, as if it were swallowing every sound. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He was lying in his own bed in his apartment. The familiar surroundings, his desk, the lamp on the nightstand, were exactly as they should be. But something wasn't right. He felt off, as if the very air in the room had changed, thickened with an unseen weight. The clock, his gaze drifted toward the nightstand, and there it was. The antique clock, the one that had started all of this. It sat innocently on the wooden surface, ticking softly, but there was something different about it now. Its hands were frozen, not moving, yet the ticking sound continued, steady and unnerving. Ethan's stomach tightened. He reached out to touch it, but a wave of hesitation washed over him. The last time he had touched the clock, everything had spiraled out of control. He had found himself trapped in a strange, decaying house, unable to understand where he was or how he had gotten there. He'd heard whispers, seen shadows moving, and felt the very fabric of reality shifting around him. Now, it was as if he had returned to the place he'd started. But was he truly back? Or was this just another layer of the nightmare he was stuck in? The sound of the clock ticking grew louder, more insistent. Ethan's breath hitched. He had to know. He couldn't keep avoiding it. With shaking hands, he picked up the clock. It was cold to the touch, almost as if it had been pulled from the depths of some forgotten grave. As soon as his fingers made contact, the room seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. The walls stretched and warped, the air thickening as if it were alive. The clock's ticking grew louder, the sound of it echoing through his skull. His heart raced, and he felt the unmistakable sensation of falling again, his stomach lurching. He let out a strangled cry, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the clock, louder and louder, until it consumed everything. When the world settled again, Ethan found himself no longer in his apartment. He stood in the middle of a vast, dark hallway. The air was damp and cold, the walls covered in thick layers of dust and grime. The floor beneath his feet creaked as he shifted his weight, sending echoes down the empty corridor. The only light came from a flickering bulb at the far end of the hall, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't the same place. This wasn't his apartment. But how had he gotten here? What was happening? The clock had taken him again. But where? What was this place? A cold draft swept through the hallway, and Ethan instinctively pulled his jacket tighter around him. The silence in the air was suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of the clock, its ticking now low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of some ancient creature lurking in the dark. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice shaky as it reverberated off the walls. But there was no answer. He took a cautious step forward, his footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every instinct told him to turn back, to run. But there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the shadows. As he walked, his mind raced. Had the clock opened some kind of portal, sending him into another dimension, or worse, into another time altogether? The clock, it seemed to be tied to something much darker than he had initially realized. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, barely audible at first, like the soft shuffle of footsteps. Ethan froze. His heart skipped a beat as the sound grew louder, drawing closer. He whirled around, his eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. The hall was still empty. The only thing moving was the flickering light above him, casting distorted, dancing shadows on the walls. But the footsteps, they hadn't stopped. The sound of them was still there, creeping closer and closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell where they were coming from, just that they were getting nearer. Every step seemed to draw him deeper into the unknown. The clock's ticking filled his ears again, now a low, rhythmic thrum that resonated through the very walls of the hallway. He had to find out what was happening. He had to understand what the clock was trying to show him. Another step, another shuffle of feet, and then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he took a stumbling step back. The figure was tall and thin, draped in tattered clothing that hung loosely from its frame. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Ethan could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze, even though he couldn't see its eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The figure stood perfectly still, as if waiting for Ethan to make the next move. The air seemed to thicken with tension, every breath heavy and labored. Then, the figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that made the hairs on Ethan's arms stand on end. "You shouldn't have touched the clock." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Who are you?" His voice trembled, but he couldn't stop himself from speaking. He needed answers. He needed to know what was going on. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering him, took a slow step forward, and Ethan instinctively backed away. "The clock is tied to the past," the figure said, its voice carrying an otherworldly weight, "and the future. It shows you what was and what will be, but it also keeps you trapped in a cycle, a loop." Ethan's mind raced as the words sunk in. A loop? What did that mean? Was this some kind of nightmare, or was he really being pulled through time? Before he could speak, the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the end of the hallway. There's more you don't understand. But if you want to break the cycle, you must go to the room." "The room?" Ethan repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The figure nodded slowly. "It's the key. Find it, or be trapped here forever." And with that, it disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan stood in stunned silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he had just heard. The clock was more than just a cursed object. It was a portal, a tool that bridged time itself. And now, it seemed like the only way out was to find this mysterious room. But where was it? How could he find it? And most importantly, could he escape before the cycle took him completely? The ticking of the clock seemed to echo in his ears again, louder than before. Each tick was a reminder of the trap he was in. He had no choice but to follow the path that the figure had set before him. He had to find the room. And so, with his heart pounding in his chest, Ethan began to move forward once more, into the darkness. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stepped deeper into the hallway. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive with every step. His mind buzzed with the figure's words. Find the room. What did it mean? Which room? The hall stretched endlessly before him, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing with each passing second, as though the very space around him was shifting. He glanced down at the clock in his hand. The ticking had grown louder again, its rhythmic sound filling his ears like the beat of a drum. The hands were moving now, but they were slow, crawling with an eerie deliberateness. He had never been more aware of time in his life. Each second felt like a weight pressing down on him. He couldn't stand still. He had to move forward. He had to find the room. The hallway felt alive with whispers, faint and indistinct, just beyond the edge of hearing. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the building had a voice, a presence that watched him as he walked. His steps echoed loudly in the silence, a reminder that he was utterly alone, or was he? The light flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The bulb above him seemed to struggle to stay lit, its dim glow barely enough to see by. But the shadows, they were another matter. They seemed to move, to twist and writhe, almost as if they had a mind of their own. Focus, Ethan told himself. He had to stay focused. He had to find the room. He walked past several doors, each one identical to the last. Wooden, old, and covered in dust. No names, no numbers, just doors leading to an unknown. He tried a few, tugging at the handles, but each door was locked. The ticking of the clock in his hand was becoming more insistent now, a constant reminder that he had no time to waste. Suddenly, he froze. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, reached his ears. It was the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was coming from behind one of the doors. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stepped cautiously toward the door, his hand gripping the cold brass handle. The scraping continued, rhythmic, like nails dragging along wood. He hesitated, his breath shallow, and then, as if guided by some unseen force, he turned the handle. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, and he stepped inside. The room was small, cramped, and completely empty except for one thing. An old, dusty grandfather clock standing in the corner. It was identical to the one he had brought with him from his apartment. The clock's face was cracked, its hands frozen at midnight, but the sound of ticking was still there, steadily, relentlessly, as though it were counting down to something. Ethan's skin crawled. This wasn't just a room. This was the room. The one the figure had spoken of. The room tied to the clock. The room that held the key to everything. As he approached the clock, he felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though he had been here before, as though time itself had already played out this moment. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the clock, and the second his fingers brushed its surface, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to stretch, the room expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. The ticking sound grew louder, vibrating through his body. Ethan stumbled backward, his head spinning. The shadows in the room swirled and thickened, coiling around him like tendrils. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. The room had him locked in its grip. The clock's hands began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster until they were a blur. Ethan's vision blurred along with them, the world around him warping and distorting. Then, as if the room itself had decided to let him go, everything stopped. Ethan gasped for air as he fell to his knees. The clock was silent now, still, but the air was heavy with the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted in the very fabric of time. He dared to look up. The room had changed. It was no longer the cramped, dark space it had been moments ago. It was now vast, stretching into an endless expanse of mirrors. Mirrors that reflected not just his image, but everything that had happened, everything that would happen. He stood up, his legs shaky beneath him, and turned to face the mirrors. Each one held a different scene, a different version of him, as though the room were showing him infinite possibilities, infinite futures. He saw himself older, tired, standing in the middle of a desolate street. He saw himself in a room full of clocks, each one ticking in time with his heartbeat. And in one of the mirrors, he saw himself dead, lifeless, his body sprawled on the floor, the clock beside him, its hands frozen at midnight. His blood ran cold. Was this his future? Was this what the clock was showing him? No, he whispered, shaking his head. This can't be real. But even as he said it, he couldn't deny the truth of what he saw. The clock, the thing that had brought him here, had shown him these possibilities. It had taken him to this room, this place where time was no longer a simple concept. Here, time was alive and it was changing. Suddenly, the mirrors began to crack, slowly at first, then with a deafening sound. Shards of glass flew across the room, reflecting endless images of Ethan, twisted and distorted. He raised his arms to protect himself, but it was no use. The shards tore into his skin, and he screamed out in pain, but the sound was lost in the cacophony of the mirrors breaking apart. The room was collapsing, warping, twisting as though it were unraveling. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as the glass shattered all around him. The floor gave way beneath his feet, and he found himself falling once again into an abyss of darkness. When he landed, the world was still, silent, but the ticking was there again, louder, more pronounced than ever. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his head spinning. He was back in the hallway, but it was different now. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. The clock in his hand was no longer in his control. It pulsed with a life of its own, its hands spinning faster and faster. Ethan had no idea where he was, but he knew one thing for sure: he was running out of time. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the echo of footsteps grew louder, drawing nearer. The walls of the hallway closed in on him, the flickering lights casting strange, distorted shadows that danced across the floor. The clock in his hand, once a simple antique, pulsed with an unnatural energy, as if it was alive, and the ticking, relentless and fast, felt like it was counting down the seconds of his life. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, his legs like lead. He could hear the footsteps now, unmistakably real, not just a figment of his imagination. Someone or something was coming for him, turning, Ethan scanned the hallway, but there was no one in sight. The sound was closer now, too close, and yet the hallway stretched endlessly before him, a void that seemed to go on forever. The only light came from the dim bulb above, casting a sickly glow over everything. The footsteps were right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The air was still, heavy with an oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. His hand trembled as he raised the clock to his ear, the ticking sound growing louder, more frantic, as if the clock itself was trying to warn him. He had to get out of this place. He had to find the answers before it was too late. Ethan's gaze darted from door to door. Each one stood there like a silent sentinel, waiting to reveal its secrets. His mind raced as he remembered the last time he had opened a door, the room with the mirrors, the strange, distorted versions of himself that he had seen there, the clock ticking faster with every passing moment. But those reflections, those glimpses of different futures, they had felt too real, too possible. He was no longer just walking through the hallways of a building. He was trapped inside a labyrinth of time itself, and he couldn't tell which direction was forward anymore. Each step felt like a journey through a different timeline. Each moment stretched and warped, leaving him feeling unmoored from reality. The footsteps were back, louder, clearer. The figure was approaching, its presence suffocating. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he looked desperately around for an escape. There had to be something, anything, to help him escape this nightmare. Suddenly, he saw it. A door slightly ajar at the very end of the hall. The door wasn't like the others. This one had no handle, no brass knob, only an ancient keyhole. The air around it seemed charged, as if it were pulling him in, urging him forward. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, each step faster than the last, the sound of his footsteps mixing with the growing, steady thrum of the clock in his hand. His pulse raced, adrenaline flooding his body as he reached the door. He fumbled with the clock, trying to use it as a key to unlock the door, but it refused to fit. Frustration burned inside him. He needed to hurry. The footsteps were almost upon him. In a moment of desperation, he dropped to his knees and pressed the clock to the keyhole, hoping against hope that it might work. The second the clock touched the cold wood, a violent shock of energy surged through him. His vision blurred, and the air around him rippled as though reality itself was unraveling. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. The door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed to exist outside of time. The walls were a strange blend of antiquity and modernity, with clocks lining every surface, ticking in unison, their hands moving in impossible directions. The air was thick with dust, but something else lingered, a heavy, unnatural stillness. Ethan stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening bang. The room was unlike any he had seen before. It wasn't just a room, it was a nexus, a place where time converged, and every second that had ever passed or ever would pass seemed to exist in the same space. The clocks on the walls didn't just tick, they throbbed, each one seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He raised his hand to his ear, hearing the unmistakable sound of the clock in his possession ticking faster, louder. He looked down at it, and to his horror, he saw the hands spinning wildly, as though they had a mind of their own. The once familiar face of the clock was now unrecognizable, its hands broken and twisted, as though it had been torn from the fabric of reality itself. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor and into his bones. The clocks on the walls began to chime, one by one, each sound more discordant than the last. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls shifting and contracting, drawing him deeper into its chaotic web. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw someone, a figure tall and shadowy, standing at the far end of the room. It was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but Ethan could feel its presence, its weight in the air. The figure was standing still, unmoving, but there was an aura of power surrounding it, a presence that was both malevolent and ancient. Ethan took a step forward, his body trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" he called, his voice hoarse and weak. The figure didn't respond, but it moved toward him, its shadow stretching unnaturally long as it approached. The clocks continued to chime, their discordant notes filling the air, drowning out everything else. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the figure grew closer, its face still hidden in the folds of darkness. He could feel its gaze, though cold and unblinking, boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, as if in answer to his question, the figure spoke. Its voice deep, echoing as though it came from the very depths of time itself. "You have no idea what you've awakened," it said, its voice like the grinding of gears, a sound that made Ethan's teeth rattle. "The clock is more than just a device. It is a doorway, and you have opened it." Ethan took a step back, the room spinning around him. "What do you mean? What is this place? What is happening?" The figure's lips twisted into a smile that was not a smile at all, more like the barest hint of a grimace. "This is where time itself is held prisoner," it replied. "And now you are part of it. You will never leave here. You will never escape time." Ethan's mind reeled. What did it mean? Was this some kind of prison? Was he trapped here forever? And then, before he could react, the figure's hand shot out, grabbing him by the wrist with an iron grip. The moment it touched him, the clocks around the room went silent, their ticking stopping all at once. The air grew deathly still, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he had imagined everything. But then, a sickening crack split the silence. The clock in his hand shattered, its face splintering into pieces that scattered across the floor. Ethan gasped, staring down at the fragments. It was gone. His connection to time had been severed. But it didn't matter. Time, he realized, was already slipping through his fingers, and there was no way out. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the eerie silence enveloped him. The shattered clock lay in pieces on the floor, its remnants reflecting the dim light of the room. His wrist still burned from the figure's cold grip, and the strange voice echoed in his mind. "You will never leave here. You will never escape time. Time." The word reverberated in his thoughts like a death knell, each tick of his own pulse reminding him that he was trapped in something far beyond his understanding. The figure, now standing in the center of the room, hadn't moved, its presence towering over Ethan as if it were woven from the very fabric of time itself. Ethan's mind raced as he backed away, the weight of the figure's words sinking in. The clock was destroyed, shattered beyond repair. But was it really gone? Could he escape this place? Or had he unleashed something he could never undo? He looked around the room again. The clocks on the walls, their faces now cracked and distorted, seemed to have a life of their own. They ticked in chaotic rhythms, their hands twisting in impossible directions. Each clock seemed to be counting down to something, a future event that Ethan could never predict. His eyes darted to the window, the only visible escape, but it was covered by thick, ancient curtains that had been there for as long as he could remember. He had no choice but to confront the figure. "What do you want from me?" Ethan demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. He knew it was futile, but he had to know. His hand still trembled, his body on the edge of collapse, but he couldn't let fear consume him now. The figure stepped forward, its movements smooth, almost calculated. It was silent for a moment, the only sound the rapid ticking of the clocks. The figure's voice, low and unfeeling, broke the silence again, each word like an icy wind scraping against his soul. "I want nothing from you, but you, Ethan, have already become part of it." The figure's face was still obscured by darkness, but Ethan could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. It wasn't just a being. It was the embodiment of something far older than time itself. It was clear now that whatever this entity was, it wasn't bound by the same rules that governed Ethan's existence. Ethan tried to steady his breath, but it came in shallow gasps. Part of what? He could barely get the words out, his mind scrambling to process everything that was happening. The figure stepped closer, its voice almost a whisper, yet it seemed to surround Ethan, closing in on him from every direction. "You opened the door, you touched the clock, and now time is yours to manipulate, but it is also your prison. You cannot change what you have awakened. Time is no longer linear here. It loops, and you will loop with it." Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't understand. What did it mean, time loops? How could he be part of something that seemed so impossible? "I don't," Ethan began, but the figure cut him off with a low, rumbling laugh. "You already know what's happening," it said, its voice like the grinding of ancient stones. "This room, this place, it exists outside of time. Time doesn't move here like it does in your world. It loops endlessly, and you are caught within it." The words echoed in Ethan's mind. Caught within it. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, as though the walls were closing in, bending in impossible angles. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, sharper, like the pounding of a drum. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. Suddenly, everything went black. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in the same room. The air felt different, stale and oppressive. The ticking had stopped, but the weight of time hung heavy in the air. The walls around him were cracked, the floor uneven. He stood in a narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering lights. His stomach twisted as he recognized the place. It was the same hallway from the apartment, the one where he had first received the clock. But now it felt wrong, like a warped version of reality. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards groaning with each step he took. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was suffocating. He stumbled forward, disoriented, trying to grasp what had just happened. He had been in the room with the clocks, the figure, the strange, ancient presence, and now he was here. How had he gotten here? Had he woken up? Was it all a dream? But deep down, Ethan knew better. This wasn't a dream. This was a nightmare, and it wasn't over yet. As he moved down the hallway, the faintest sound reached his ears, the ticking of a clock. He froze. The clock! He looked around frantically, his breath quickening as he scanned his surroundings. And there it was, sitting on a dusty table, its face cracked, its hands still frozen in time. The antique clock, the same one that had haunted him since the very beginning. He approached it cautiously, his hand shaking as he reached for it. But the second his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the room around him shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering lights growing dimmer, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder and closer. "No!" Ethan gasped, backing away from the clock, his heart racing. He couldn't let this happen again. He couldn't keep going in circles. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and Ethan knew without a doubt that he was no longer alone. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the door creaked open. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen to the spot. The footsteps from beyond the door had stopped, and now a deep silence hung in the air. It was suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He wanted to turn around, to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Something about this place, this twisted version of reality, held him in its grip. The clock, it had brought him here, and it would be the one to decide how it would end. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached out for the doorknob. He had no idea what awaited him on the other side, but he knew he couldn't stay in this hallway forever. The walls were closing in, the air growing heavier by the second, as if time itself was pushing him forward. He slowly turned the knob. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the room beyond. It was identical to the one he had been in earlier, the room with the broken clock. The walls were still cracked, the clock still ticking erratically, but now there was something new. A figure stood in the center of the room, bathed in shadow, its features hidden in the darkness. It was the same figure, the one that had spoken to him before, the one that had warned him about time. Ethan's pulse raced, but he forced himself to step inside. He couldn't back down now. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure's voice echoed, cold and haunting, sending chills down Ethan's spine. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "I'm not afraid of you." The figure didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, all Ethan could hear was the relentless ticking of the clocks. It was deafening now, as if time was speeding up, forcing him into an inevitable conclusion. "You should be," the figure finally said, stepping forward. Its form shifted in the dim light, becoming more defined, but still unnervingly difficult to focus on. "You've disrupted the cycle. You've broken the rules." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What cycle? What rules? The figure's face seemed to emerge from the darkness, its features still obscured but its presence growing stronger. "Time is a delicate thing," it said, its voice growing colder, "and you've played with it. You've awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed." Ethan's mind raced. He had no memory of doing anything to disturb time, but the figure's words felt like a warning. He could feel it now, the oppressive weight of time pressing down on him, as though every second was an eternity. The clocks around him ticked faster now, their hands spinning wildly as if they were caught in some kind of frenzy. The air shimmered with energy, and Ethan could feel the temperature in the room drop. He shivered, rubbing his arms in a futile attempt to warm himself. "What do you want from me?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling. He couldn't keep pretending he wasn't terrified. Whatever this thing was, it was powerful, too powerful. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it stepped closer, its form growing clearer, more defined. It was tall, shrouded in dark robes, and its face was a pale, ghostly mask. Its eyes were empty voids, like two endless pits of darkness. Ethan couldn't look away. "You've seen the consequences of breaking the rules," the figure said, its voice now chillingly calm. "But there's more. You are not just caught in the loop. You are the loop." Ethan's stomach twisted. He didn't understand. "What does that mean? What are you saying?" "You are bound to this place now. Time will repeat itself over and over, and you will be trapped in this cycle forever," the figure explained. "There is no escape, no end." Ethan's mind reeled. Was this it? Was this his fate? Was he really stuck in an endless loop, condemned to relive this nightmare forever? The thought was too much to bear. "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be happening." The figure's laugh was low and cruel. "You think you can outrun time? You think you can defy it? Time always finds its way back." Ethan stepped backward, panic rising in his chest. The clocks were spinning faster now, their ticking a deafening roar that filled the room. His vision blurred, his head spinning as the world around him seemed to distort. The walls warped, stretching and shrinking, and the floor beneath him shifted like quicksand. The figure raised its hand, and the clocks fell silent. Ethan gasped for air. His heart raced in his chest, and he looked around, disoriented. Everything had gone still, unnervingly still. The clocks, the air, even the darkness seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then, with a jolt, time resumed. The clocks began ticking again, slower this time, as if testing Ethan. He stood frozen, his mind racing, his body tense. What was happening? Was he really stuck in this never-ending loop? "You're not the first," the figure said, its voice low and cold. "Others have come before you. They've tried to escape, tried to break the cycle. But they all failed. And now you are just another part of the clock. Another piece of the puzzle." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let this be his fate. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking, and stared at the figure. "I won't let you control me," he said. His voice steady despite the terror clawing at him. The figure's expression darkened, its empty eyes boring into him. "You have no choice." Ethan's breath quickened. This was it. He had to do something. Anything. Before the figure could react, he turned and sprinted for the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't know what he was running toward or how he could escape, but he had to try. As he reached the door, the figure's voice rang out one last time, chilling him to his core. "Time is already gone, Ethan. And now, so are you." Ethan's heart raced as he ran for the door. His fingers gripped the cold brass handle, but the room felt like it was shrinking around him. Every step he took toward the exit was matched by the figure's voice, each syllable like a chilling echo that reverberated within the walls. "Time is already gone, Ethan. And now, so are you." His breath quickened as he turned the handle. But as soon as he did, a violent force slammed the door shut, trapping him in the room once again. The entire space seemed to close in on him as if the walls themselves were alive, pressing against him, suffocating him with the weight of inevitability. He stumbled back, heart hammering against his chest. The clocks, they were ticking faster now, spinning in erratic patterns that blurred the edges of reality. They ticked with a strange urgency, as if they were counting down to something that Ethan couldn't yet understand. Ethan's back hit the wall, and his vision blurred with panic. "No," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I can't be a part of this. This can't be my fate." A low, deep laugh resonated from the shadowed figure. Its face was still obscured, but the darkness in its eyes felt all-consuming. Ethan could see it now, the way the figure seemed to shift and distort, like it was woven from the very fabric of time itself, part of an ancient force that had no beginning or end. "You can fight it all you want," the figure said, its voice like a whisper on the wind. "But time doesn't care. Time doesn't answer to anyone. It simply is." Ethan tried to breathe, trying to steady himself, trying to find a way out of this unrelenting nightmare. But the more he struggled, the more the ticking intensified, and it felt like the clocks were attacking his mind. The relentless ticking drilled into his skull, a sharp, jagged sound that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. "Please," Ethan gasped. "I don't want this. I won't be part of your game." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. It was almost as if it could read his mind, knowing his every thought, his every fear. "You're not here by chance," the figure said, its voice cold and empty. "You were chosen. The clock chose you." "Chosen?" Ethan whispered, confused and terrified. "Yes," the figure answered, "because you saw what you shouldn't have. You saw the truth of time itself. And now you'll never escape it. You're part of the clock, and it will keep ticking over and over until there's nothing left of you." The figure raised a hand, and with it, the clocks fell silent, every tick halting at once. The stillness in the room was deafening, but Ethan's mind was buzzing. This was it. This was the moment he would either give in to his fate or try to break free. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the clocks, the very air itself. His hand trembled, but he knew he couldn't give up. There had to be a way to break the cycle. There had to be a way to fight back. Suddenly, a strange thought crossed his mind. A memory, vague at first, surfaced from deep within. The moment he had first found the clock, how it had seemed to call out to him. How it had felt like something was reaching for him, guiding him to this point. What if the clock wasn't just a curse? What if it was the key to his freedom? His mind raced as he turned back toward the figure, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. "You said I was chosen by the clock. So that means I can control it, too." The figure's laughter echoed again, colder than before. "You can try, but time is not something you can control. Time controls you." Ethan's thoughts began to race even faster. The clocks, the ticking. If he could understand the clock's pattern, the way it ticked at odd hours, could he reverse it? Could he undo what had been done? He had to try. He reached for the nearest clock, a large, ornate grandfather clock that loomed over him. Its face seemed to twist and ripple in the shadows, but he ignored the sensation of dread creeping up his spine. He had to act now. He had to break the cycle. With trembling hands, he opened the back of the clock and began to manipulate the gears, twisting them, attempting to break the mechanism. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the clocks around him began to tick. Slowly at first, but louder, more erratic. A sharp pain shot through his head as the clocks began spinning faster. He gritted his teeth, focusing all his energy on the task at hand. The room was shaking now, the sound of ticking so loud it felt as if it would split his skull. And then, with a jolt, the room went completely still. Ethan froze, his eyes wide. He could feel it, the change in the air, the way the space around him had shifted. It was as if time itself had stopped. The figure was gone. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope. Was it over? Had he managed to break the cycle? But then, the clocks began ticking again. Slowly, steadily, and Ethan realized, with a chilling clarity, that it had all been for nothing. The cycle wasn't broken. It had just reset. He staggered back, his knees buckling beneath him. The figure reappeared, its face clearer now, and its eyes locked onto his with an unsettling calm. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice colder than ever. "Time is already gone. And now so are you." As the figure stepped forward, Ethan realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just stuck in time. He was part of it. And time was the one thing he could never outrun.